Dr. Andy Hall from CSIRO in Canberra in Australia. I think many of you know Andy from his previous life in ICRISAT. I'll explain some of his accomplishments and history briefly. He's got a PhD from 1994 from the University of Sussex, looking at science and technology policy studies, and has mainly worked in international circles looking at innovation systems. I think the most interesting part of his career for us would be from probably 1996 when he was a special project scientist for ICRISAT, seconded from the Natural Resources Institute in the UK. He worked on public-private sector partnership in post-harvest innovation, utilisation of sorghum in India, funded by DFID. And from 2004 to 2010, he was still in Hyderabad mainly, but working for the United Nations University, again looking at how you put agricultural research into use in Asia and Africa, as well as a number of other innovation related subject areas. Most recently he's been doing, he worked as a consultant from 2010 to 2014, and since 2014 working for CSIRO as a senior principal research scientist in the Agriculture Flagship based in Canberra. And he's helping CSIRO look at their research and capacity building activities on the application of innovation systems thinking in agricultural research in both the work in Australia and the work in other places, especially Asia. And he's a group lead for research for development in the Agriculture and Global Change Program. Recently, he's kept his interest in the CG, and he's just completed a review for the ISPC, review of multi-stakeholder partnerships in innovation systems. And so today's lecture has been put together from a few days of talking together with Andy and the team, and he's, I think, giving partly some reflections on innovation systems and how it relates to our work in the new program that we've created, Innovation Systems for the Drylands. So without further ado, I ask Andy to give us some wise words.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It was a long introduction. I hadn't realised I'd done so much. Let me just say what I'm interested in life. I'm a science and technology policy analyst who's always had an interest in the question of how do you make better use of science and scientific knowledge for development, be that in Australia or in the developing world, where I've worked in both South Asia and Africa quite a lot. I'm going to tell you a whole lot of stories and things this morning, this afternoon. It's not a visually very exciting presentation, but hopefully I can make up with that with my words. This is my overview. I'd written the second sentence in my abstract, which nobody seemed to be able to understand. So I thought I'd just quote properly Ashish Nandy, where he said, "Cricket is an Indian game accidentally discovered by the British." So what he meant by that was, us Brits, in the Victorian era came up with this strange game of the bat and ball, but actually it's really blossomed into something of a huge phenomena here in India. So I opened my abstract by saying agricultural innovation systems is a global phenomena accidentally discovered in ICRISAT nearly 20 years ago. And that's a bit of a kind of ego trip for me, but when we sat here at ICRISAT, we wrote some of the kind of early papers around innovation systems. Sitting at the end of that corridor, I think we did some of our best work. And this is going to be a bit of a kind of ego trip presentation, because I'm going to talk about some of that work as kind of scene setting for the discussion about innovation systems. So it's going to be about sort of a historical perspective on where we were then, what it was like then, where we've got to with these ideas, where ICRISAT's got to, and then what might we think about doing next. So could this innovation systems idea really make a difference, and what might that look like when we were doing it? So a trip back in time, and again this is another personal story. In 1991 I came here as a PhD student after having done a whole lot of field work in Thailand, where I'd been looking at the spread of rhizobium inoculant technology. And I stood up, I think it was this room, and I made this presentation to the microbiologists, all of them scientists, and I said, actually, scientists could learn a lot from farmers about the adoption of technology and local innovations. And this was clearly the wrong thing to say, because after having presented that, there was stunned silence in the room, and everybody thought I was mad, and probably correct. But the point of the story is that perceptions about science and how it should be organized have changed substantially since then. And I don't think there's anybody in this room who would stand up and tell me that there's nothing we can learn from farmers. So ideas about science and innovation are a moving feast. Our ideas about them change. So that's a little bit of a personal bit of history. Then back in the 1990s, again, I was coming to ICRISAT on both at the beginning of the decade, then towards the middle and end. There was a growing concern amongst donors about the impact performance of agricultural research. There was a famous review, I believe, of ICRISAT where they complained about shelves of technology that were never being used. And the sort of retort from the research organizations was, of course, well, we were never set up to reduce poverty. We were set up as scientific organizations to use science to develop technologies. So that was very much the kind of flavor of the time. And then in the late 1990s, CGIAR reform started to call for more partnerships. All of a sudden this partnership word was everywhere. And that sounded quite promising. But then at the same time, there was a whole discussion in the documentation coming from the CG about how the centres needed to go back to the science heartlands of the CG and how we had to draw back from development and extension-like activities because others had a comparative advantage. And that was very much the language of the time. So lots of concerns about impact, but also lots of concerns that we might not continue to be this sort of special scientific organization. So there were turbulent times. Then as the 90s progressed, there was a number of early signs of change, but change that was not without its controversies. In the late 1990s, the DG at the time, Shauki Barghouti, had this idea of setting up a graduate business school as part of ICRISAT. And he had this vision that we could better link to the private sector in this way, but he also had a vision that if we had an alumni of entrepreneurs running agri-businesses, they'd become donors to ICRISAT. An interesting idea. It didn't get off the ground. Shauki left frustrated for a number of reasons, but that thinking was starting to creep in. 1999-2000, and I can't remember the exact date of this, I should have looked it up this morning, ICRISAT signs an agreement for a seed consortium with the private sector. And again, that was highly controversial. There was many scientists saying, our work is working for the public good, it's not working for the private sector. And there's a number of apocryphal stories around the signing of the agreement. One of the stories is that it was during the period when Swindale was looking after ICRISAT between DGs, and he wouldn't sign it. And he went on travel, and Rodamiro Ortez, who was acting as DG, signed it. Willie Dar told me that it was the first piece of paper he signed. So either way you look at it, it was a controversial thing that someone needed to stand up and say, yes, actually we can work with the private sector. Other things that were starting to happen in the late 90s, participatory plant breeding, Eva's work on pearl millet. It was controversial, it was happening, but it was controversial. There was a lot of debates within the Institute about the benefits of pot trials versus farm trials. I remember that quite clearly. And then the other thing that happened throughout the 80s, but throughout the 90s, but particularly the late 90s, was the explosive growth of impact assessment as a prestigious area of economics research. And when I first came into the CG, the economists were spending huge amounts of time doing impact assessment studies. And that was seen as a way of countering this argument that investments in science weren't having impact. We're still countering those arguments, as you know. So, early interest in innovation, why research partnerships really matter. I think this is 2000. In 2000, there was a CG-wide conference in Costa Rica on impact assessment research, and it was a massive event. And presentation after presentation stood up and gave evidence of the impact of investments in agricultural research. So that I remember the rates of return of investment varied from 0 to 7,000. That didn't seem to matter. People seemed to be happy with that. And the main concern was about attribution. Now, at that conference, there was a slot scheduled called New Architectures for Impact. And I wrote a paper called Why Research Partnerships Really Matter, Innovation Theory, Institutional Arrangements and Implications for Developing New Technologies for the Poor. I didn't have very snappy titles in those days, obviously. And I wrote it partially because I was sick to death of hearing everybody talk about partnerships but not knowing why. But also I wrote it because I was getting increasingly interested in how this innovation thing worked, and that concepts around innovation systems, which I'm going to talk about briefly next, were making the case why partnership and institutional arrangements, ways of working that help partnerships happen, were so critical if innovation was actually going to take place. And without innovation, there wasn't going to be impact. Now, the funny part of the story, typical for this sort of presentation in a conference like this, we were slotted on the last day. 3 people turned up. One of them was in the wrong session. One of them was drunk. And the third one was the other presenter whose paper had been slotted into the wrong session. So it wasn't a rip-roaring success, but my ego does have to tell you that this is my most quoted ever paper. So what is an innovation system? I'm sure many of you have seen this dreadful diagram 1,000 times, but what it's really trying to say is innovation, the putting into use of ideas for economic and social good. Innovation emerges when you connect pieces of knowledge between different players in the ecosystem or innovation system, whatever you want to call it. So you need research organizations there, but you also need enterprises there. You need to be connected to market and consumers, you know about demand. Often you need go-between organizations who help connect up different people. There might be technology consultants, there might be NGOs, there might be industry associations. So you need to connect up people so that ideas flow in between these different sources of information so that you can actually work out how to use knowledge for social good. Now we made 2 other points in this framework, and it wasn't my framework, we borrowed it from somewhere else and creatively reworked it. The 2 other points were that actually if you wanted to get connections between different people and sources of information, that process was shaped very strongly by the routines and practices, what we call institutional arrangements in organizations. So if you've got an organization that's got no history and culture of partnership and participation, you tend to sit and work on your own. So these routines and culture things were very important. We also saw that policies and the enabling environment were also very important. So if you've got policies where you separate research and extension and business development into 3 ministries and into 3 organizational arrangements and have different schemes for them, those things are going to work independently. So having a policy environment that starts to bring things together and provides incentives for people to innovate is really important. The last 2 things that we said, often there are triggers which come along which mean that your existing connections are not working very well. So those triggers might be a new policy. So we looked at innovation in Himachal Pradesh, where environmental policy had meant that farmers had to change from wooden tomato boxes to something else. And there was a need to reconfigure the relationships in the innovation system so they could come up with a new packaging technology. And then the final thing, which is probably the strangest thing of all, is that if you've got an innovation system that's working, it's not just delivering innovations of economic and social good. It's delivering new ways of doing innovation. You learn how to do this thing by doing it. So you have new partnerships, you have new cultures which are open to participation and partnership. You have new ways of engaging with stakeholders that you hadn't engaged with before. You have new relationships and networks. So these things are dynamic and keep churning away. Okay, I sometimes wonder how many times I will have to present that diagram. So, the next thing that happened in the story is that there was, after 2 years, after that first big CGIAR conference on impact assessment, they had another one, which was called, Why has Impact Assessment Not Made More of a Difference? Because we'd had all of these impact studies, and they still had the same problem. So we went along to it and we listened to endless presentations of impact assessment studies, and the rates of return were still ranging from 0 to 7,000. And they weren't thinking so much about attribution that year, but they were thinking about how could we just refine the methodology of doing this impact assessment? We must be able to get better at it somehow. So we wrote another paper, which we called From Measuring Impact to Learning Institutional Lessons. And this was really putting our innovation systems idea forward of saying, well, okay, because innovation systems is about building up new capacities and that it's necessary to learn your way into that, it's no good just measuring the inputs and outputs. You actually need to start and study, and I use that word very broadly, you need to study what's an effective way of innovating and learn from that and continuously improve your practice. That's my second most quoted paper, by the way, for my ego trip. So that was our next point, that you need to move from measuring to learning. So impact assessment, we said, was good as an accountability tool, but it had limited diagnostic ability to tell you how and why you were having impact. And then the final one is the innovations in innovation idea. Through various strange means of funding, we did a whole series of case studies using the innovation systems idea as a lens to look at what innovation systems looked like. And we produced this book which had this strange name of Innovations in Innovation, Reflections on Partnering and Learning. And again, it was talking to that same theme of from measuring to learning. We were saying, actually, the way of doing innovation needs to be continuously changed. So you think back to ICRISAT in 1991 when I came here, the means of innovation was very much about on-station trials, technology development, extension of that out to farmers. Then there was a period where the innovation was about participatory research, and then more latterly the innovation was about how to work with the private sector. So this modality of doing innovation needs to continuously change. And I'm going to give some ICRISAT examples in a minute about innovations in innovation that I've seen this week. So we've done all of that work where we could do lots of backward-looking case studies and explain how innovation happened. The next challenge was to move from understanding the innovation process to actually starting to practice it. So using it as a way of implementing. And there were some general principles about better connecting research to the private sector. I had many discussions with many of you, some of whom are in this room, about how you could better work with the private sector. We were lucky enough to be managing one of DFID's research programs, and we managed to persuade the director of that program that he should take on board the innovation systems idea, and he completely reconfigured his program for what he called a coalitions approach, which is really kind of forerunner of the idea of innovation platforms, but saying that you needed to bring multiple people together within research projects, and you needed to use that as a way of learning lessons about how to do research better. At the same time, there was something called the CGIAR institutional learning and change initiative, and that was a network across the CGIAR for organizational learning, organizational change. So again, it was this idea, there must be interesting things going on there. Can't we learn from that and influence management within the centres? Complete failure as far as I can see, and I hope nobody from ILAC's listening in other parts of the world. And ILAC came to an end eventually, I think 2 years ago. Complete failure is probably an exaggeration, but it was a set of people like myself who were intellectually interested in the study of innovation rather than people in management positions who had the agency to make changes within those organizations. And then finally we had a DFID project called Fodder Innovation, where we said, look, the issue that we're trying to deal with is not technology scarcity. The issue that we're trying to deal with is innovation capacity scarcity. And what we meant by that was that the key bottleneck was about connecting people and institutional change, which we called innovation capacity, rather than developing new technologies. And of course, it wasn't an either or, but the thing that was lacking was this innovation capacity. All right, so we're now kind of rolling forward to sort of the mid-2000s, and there was a kind of toolbox was starting to emerge. So innovation systems diagnosis, so a way of looking at systems and saying, well, okay, these are the bottlenecks, these are the entry points that we could start to work on. Innovation platforms were starting to come into currency, probably mid-2000s to late 2000s. An idea about connecting people and ideas, but then also an idea about catalyzing wider systems changes at multiple scales. So saying that these platforms were not just about working with farmers and maybe market players, but actually a way of learning how to do research differently and identifying and working on policy and institutional constraints that were preventing systems change more generally. Public-private sector partnerships, they became pretty much standard, probably exaggerating slightly there, and M, E, and L. So we had M and E before, monitoring and evaluation, and then we went to M, E, and learning, so MEL. So this was about developing M and E systems that had built into them real-time learning to address uncertainty in the innovation process and uncertainty about how you actually went about innovation capacity development. Now those of you who come from the action research tradition will recognize this as the act, reflect, replan, etc., that learning cycle. But those sorts of ideas were starting to gain currency, and as we stand today, there's toolboxes of ME and L techniques that would fill this room, and we'll come on to why they're not being used in a minute. So here we are today. We've reached what I'm calling the new normal. The new normal's been with us for a couple of years now. So working with the private sector within the CG and research organizations, it's pretty uncontroversial as an idea, still challenging, but there isn't this very strong pushback against it. Embedding research and development programming, that's becoming quite a common vehicle, particularly in Africa, where I see a number of the projects are starting to look more like development projects with research in them. And certainly some of the project work that I'm doing with CSIRO in Indonesia is very much about development projects with research embedded in them. Partnership is a core modality. Nobody would argue with the importance of partnership anymore. Participation platforms, multi-stakeholder processes are now pretty much routine, even if it's in the rhetoric rather than the reality. And there's a proliferation of systems-inspired agricultural research for development approaches and brands. So it's all out there. But some things have got lost along the way. Innovation systems diagnosis, it's cumbersome to do. People don't know how to do it. It's rarely done, and if it's done badly. Innovation platforms, they've become a kind of blanket application. Nobody remembers the reason why they're used. They're just one of those things that you use in projects. Far too farmer-centric. I once rudely called some innovation platforms in West Africa farmer groups on steroids, and the systemic change agenda has been forgotten. So that innovation platforms are seen as a means of transferring technologies rather than transforming the systems that are required to actually make use of those technologies. I saw a poster in an institute that I won't mention that said technology transfer through an innovation systems approach. Yeah, I found that quite interesting. So these ideas have got mixed up. The underlying ideas of why to do them have been forgotten. MEL, as I say, we've got acres of MEL tools out there. They're cumbersome. We tried to use something called Most Significant Change Stories in West Africa. Seems like a good idea. Get people to tell you what's changed. Use that change as a kind of replanning tool and as a way of collecting information about impact. Imagine trying to get hundreds of these change stories written up and then synthesized. And who writes them, who synthesizes them? Extremely difficult. So they're poorly implemented, partially because they're not very good. And there's a dreadful mismatch between donor needs and some of these tools. Some of the tools that are useful for learning are qualitative. Many of our donors want to know number of farmers, improvement in income of those farmers, etc. So there's a mismatch there. And then the institutional change agenda for R&D organizations has also seemed to have got lost. And the discussion seems to be about better projects rather than about better organizations engaging in the innovation thing. So the focus has been pushed out to the projects rather than those projects helping rethink how organizations operate. So, okay, now the thing that I've been kind of chewing around all week, and partially following a discussion with Peter on Monday, or Tuesday, sorry, is what is this innovation systems thing? Is it a research framework? Is it an approach? Is it a way of working? My view is that it remains a powerful way of investigating how innovation takes place. I've got no doubts about that. But I think it's weakened by its limiting understanding of the causal links between better processes and impact. So we've got a toolbox about process design. We know qualitatively it's better to do it like this. But where's our evidence base that doing it better like that is leading to impact? As a research implementation and operational approach, it needs to be that, but it's too tool-centric. Implementation holds it back. So actually how you do this thing, it's not a matter of having tools, but it's actually having a group of people who can use those tools and have a systems outlook so that they can work out where the opportunities are, reconfigure and adjust. It's not just about pulling out an innovation platform and saying, okay, we've done it. It's about something more than that. And I've been calling this the difference between working systematically, okay, I've got a checklist or a log frame of things that I do, and if I just do them, everything will be all right, to a much more tentative way of working where you're working systemically, trying things out, looking for opportunities, seeing where change is happening, readjusting. And that's not something that can be simply put into a manual. All right, what does this look like at ICRISAT then? I think I've been seeing over the week what I'm calling systems-inspired engagement with making innovation happen. All right? These are the innovations that innovations in innovation that I've been talking about, but they're innovations in innovation that have taken place without talking about innovation systems. These are initiatives that have been driven by people who have been exposed to these ideas in one way or another, recognize that partnership's important perhaps, but are acting systemically rather than systematically because of the sort of people who are leading these things. And I've given 4 examples, and if there's other people listening who think they're doing this and I haven't listed them, that's only because I haven't spoken to them or I didn't have enough room. So I think I saw 4. The ICRISAT Development Centre, embedding research in development and having large and tangible impacts. The Agribusiness Innovation Platform, incubating innovation with the private sector. That was a germ of an idea 10, 15 years ago, but that's really something interesting and special that could be rolled out much further. Goat marketing in Zimbabwe, where you've got farming systems and marketing systems, innovation for the poor, creating new and better markets for goats. It's transformed the goat sector in Zimbabwe. And that's not because someone said, do an innovation system or do a platform, although it is using platforms. It's because it's led by somebody who thinks systemically. Groundnut exports in Malawi, I've only heard this one secondhand, but it sounded pretty good. And it's something about connecting farmers' technology and the private sector for export markets. But again, it's about someone who's navigated this thing and seems to be doing a pretty good job of it with huge impacts. All right, so those are 4 different ways of organizing innovation, what I'm calling horses for courses modes of innovation. You wouldn't want to do everything through an agribusiness innovation platform. You wouldn't want to do everything through an ICRISAT development center. You wouldn't want to do everything through goat platforms, and you wouldn't want to do everything in the way that groundnuts has been tackled. But there are nevertheless 4 legitimate and successful ways of organizing innovation for impact. Okay, all good. What could we add? What could we add to that? I think there might be something called innovation support tools. Sounds like another fanciful Andy Hall idea. What might they be? Well, systems diagnosis. I think that's a dead horse that's been flogged, but maybe there might still be a bit of a life in it. There must be some tool that we can use to get a rapid understanding of the innovation systems that we're trying to work with and seeing where the key bottlenecks are. MEL, again, a bit of a checkered past, but surely there must be a bit of a future there somewhere. It's got to be in that process somehow. We must be able to have a way of actually monitoring and learning what we're doing. Process design, organizational and institutional development design. There's a series of ideas that come from experience and theory about how you can design processes better. We know that organizational and institutional development design is going to be important. I've been hearing a lot of talk around farmer producer organizations. Imagine if we had expertise in being able to set up those designs and actually make them work. Modeling. I've been talking to Peter a lot about hard systems modeling, and Anthony. That seems to be a very powerful tool that could help guide conversations in innovation processes so people could come to more useful answers and directions. Technology support, we're probably already doing a lot of that. Identification of new research challenges, and identification of institutional and organizational challenges within our own organization, within CSIRO. So if we're starting to work more with the private sector, what are the things in our internal setup that are still getting in the way of being able to do that better? What's missing from the picture? I think there's 2 things that are missing from the picture. The first is analysis and lessons about the effectiveness. And we need to do that for 3 reasons. We've got these useful modes of innovation sitting out there. What we need to start and do is understand why they're working, how they're working, and what their impact is. And we need to do that to inform our own strategy, so that the next time we're in a situation where there's a goat marketing problem, actually it wasn't a goat marketing problem, it was a farming systems problem. The next time we've got that situation, we know what to do. We know what tools to bring to bear and what processes that we need to put in place. So we need to do it for that sort of strategy reason. We need to do it for publication reason, because everybody is struggling with this question of how do we organize for innovation and impact. And I think we need to do it for donors. We need to have an evidence-based case that we work the way we do in different contexts for reasons that we have evidence that this is an effective way of doing things, and it's not simply a success story. So I think that's missing from the picture. I think the other thing that's missing from the picture is an organizational strategy to enable new modes of innovation beyond what I'm calling positive deviant individuals. These things have popped up and happened and have been driven by individuals, but what could an organization like ICRISAT do to make sure that it was seeding these ideas continuously? Instead of serendipity and individual agency, how could the organization think about how it could make these modes of innovation pop up and flourish? Right, this is my last slide, just so you don't think I've just come here to look at you guys and tell you what to do. This is a tiny little bit on what I'm doing in CSIRO. CSIRO is Australia's national science agency, and at about the middle of last year we had what we've been referring to as the innovation big bang. Government policies shifted very much to an innovation agenda. CSIRO's shifted in its strategy from being a national science agency to Australia's innovation catalyst and innovation hub. We've been told to be much more outward facing, much more impact orientated. It's no longer about science for science sake, it's about science for impact, and particularly impact through the private sector. So we've had a big strategy change, and now we're trying to think through what that means organizationally and operationally. So I have a small project in CSIRO which is just about to kick off, called How to Get Better at Innovation. And this is building on some earlier work that I did about trying to think of an analytical framework to look better at the innovation process. But what it's done, it's wrapped up a number of things into one project vehicle. One, it's wrapped up some stuff on organizational development, so things around impact planning, tracking and reporting, so doing theories of change with scientists, developing impact sentinels so that people know what the impact is that their work's aiming for, and actually thinking about how that can be used to report our impact for review processes and other things. We have another part of that called documenting and sharing effective impact practice. We do this thing called practice notes, where we get scientists who've worked out how to work with the private sector better to tell us the tricks of the trade, write it down on 2 pieces of paper, and then we share that with other people. And we have something called an innovation think tank, which is a kind of cross-agriculture initiative thinking about how to progress innovation culture. So we've just developed a report on implementation options for the management of our agriculture area on the sorts of things that they could do to introduce a stronger innovation culture into the organization. We're doing some tool development. We're doing benchmarking of innovation capacity, partially because I've got an interest in that, but there's the potential to do some other stuff. And we're trying to develop a common analysis and practice framework on innovation and impact, so that the group of people in CSIRO working on this are starting to use and think the similar sorts of ideas, and then being able to use that expertise both internally for organizational development, but externally also for winning projects and developing strategic partnerships with organizations for tool development. So we're doing case studies. We're also learning from program implementation, so learning from our externally funded projects. And as I said, strategic partnerships to develop new tools. So that's it. I'm going to stop. I've probably gone over the limit. Oh, last one, conclusions. So what are we going to say? ICRISAT is well placed to take innovation systems to the next level. You've got a new structure. You've got a program with the word innovation systems in it. You've got this great historic legacy. You've got these interesting things that have been happening that I've just talked about, our positive deviance. And I think you could use it in taking it to the next level in 3 ways. As an operational strategy in AR4D, so doing our projects better. As a research framework for better understanding how impact happens and evidencing this with donors. And as a way of framing discussions and directions about organizational culture, mission and strategy. Thank you. There, that is the end.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy. Let's go straight into questions and make use of the time. I think Kieran's pretty keen to ask a question.
Thanks, Andy. I think that was very interesting and took me back also 15, 18 years back, when we used to have discussions. I think that model you presented, the dynamics of various dynamics for the system for innovations, and there's so many components, the internal and external dependence on each other, and everything can go wrong actually.
Yeah.
And that's what happens most of the time. So is there a way of, putting things in a more concrete fashion, so that all those components are bound together properly? Because apparently CGIAR has not really capitalized on this. We have been discussing on various fora. It hasn't really happened CGIAR-wide. I think ICRISAT was, pioneer in a way, started all this long back, but it hasn't really caught up despite several efforts. So is it something to do with the institutional change you're talking about, or?
I'm not sure if I completely get your question. Is the question about within the wider system? Can something be done about that? I don't know, because I think in a dynamic system like that, these connections between different bits are always going to be coming together for certain purposes and then coming apart again, because you need to continuously reconfigure those bits as you tackle different sorts of innovation problems. I guess that the trick here is about having the flexibility and the agility to reconfigure those connections at an appropriate time, because one way of interpreting innovation systems is that this is a blueprint about how the pieces connect. Well, actually, how the pieces connect is correct for today, but it won't be correct for tomorrow, and it won't be correct for the year after that. So the real trick is about agility and being able to reconfigure those things. And that's really challenging. I think it does, yeah. I think a continuous institutional change agenda. This institutional change thing, it can't be something that's done one-off, because we're dealing with an environment where we don't know what the challenges and triggers and opportunities are going to be. So we need to be continuously preparing ourselves for that. I mean, we wouldn't have imagined 10, 15 years ago that there would be so many opportunities with both Indian public funding and CRS funding, for example. So having the flexibility to be able to connect with that, critical.
Andy, I can ask you lots of questions, but I guess the one that's at the top of my mind is when you talk about CSIRO changing from being a national science agency to being an innovation hub. What a disaster. The comparative strengths that CSIRO as an applied research organisation, or ICRISAT or the CGIAR, is the fact that we're grounded in our disciplinary science as a pathway to development outcomes, and we have those thousands of impact assessments to say it's a good investment if you do this. if you want to rename our position as an innovation hub, we're no different to, you know, any venture capital group or any NGO out there. So it's a big mistake in my view, is that we don't hang on to our disciplinary science expertise, still move in this direction, but not forsake our research science grounding.
Well, I didn't call it the Innovation Catalyst Hub. That's not my words. That is the organisation's strategy. But you know, I think this is a live debate as we're talking, and there is a recognition that the disciplinary science strength is what makes an organisation like CSIRO a powerful player in the innovation system. But there's also a recognition that it has a function over and above that disciplinary strength, which is about connecting together other people. So connecting the universities in, connecting into the private sector. And that the challenge of that, of course, is not throwing the science out with the science baby out with the bathwater, maintaining it, but also doing these other things so that you're playing a connecting role and you've got an interface with industry, and that you're convening many of the bits of the innovation system that aren't convened already. What that's going to look like, we don't know. But that's going to be the challenge of the next few years of working through that. But this is very much a live debate within the organisation.
Tinku.
Thanks, Andy. I have a message here from the DG, David, who's in Nairobi. He's written in, so he says, thanks, Andy, for a great synthesis and ideas for the way forward. How can these ideas be integrated in performance-based management, business intelligence for implementing our country strategies, and a way to support more agile and successful programs to achieve the SDGs? That's one question from David.
Only one?
There's another one.
Okay.
But I'll let you answer that first. Do you want me to repeat it?
Yeah, let me just hear that.
How can these ideas be integrated in performance-based management, business intelligence for implementing our country strategies, and a way to support more agile and successful programs to achieve the SDGs?
Integrated into performance management, I think that's probably the easiest one to pick off. I think that is about developing some key impact areas that the organisation thinks that it can tackle, developing theories of change around those, and then developing a monitoring system to track and monitor the progress towards those. So not doing that simply at a project level, but having organisational level performance measurement tools, KPIs, whatever you want to call them. That's certainly the direction that we're moving in CSIRO. I'm not saying that we're doing it perfectly, we're not by a long way, but actually the process of taking scientists through the idea of, well, this is the impact that our rhetoric says that we're going to achieve, and these are the steps that we would need to go through to achieve that, and here are indicators to tell us how we're progressing along that pathway. And then, of course, thinking about who's responsible for monitoring and driving that pathway. Strategic intelligence. I'll skip that one. Let me take this next question.
How do we move beyond the reductionist impact assessment we practice now to understanding the processes that led to impact? What models, examples are there? And that's from Alistair in Nairobi.
Alistair, yeah.
Under ICRISAT.
I mean, I think this is the big challenge for the innovation systems set of ideas. Innovation systems is very good at unpicking processes, but the way it works is to say, well, we have an idealized view of what processes we would like to see in place. It doesn't have a way of saying, well, if you have these ideas in place, then we can understand the sorts of impacts that are likely to come from that. And I think there's a need for methodological development. And there are some ideas in the evaluation literature, theory-based evaluation, which is very much along those lines of saying, well, we've had an impact of this sort. Let's interrogate the processes which led to that and test out whether that impact has actually occurred from what we did or whether it's occurred from a range of other things. But I think we're a long way off having a commonly agreed on framework about how you would do that connecting quality of innovation process with magnitude of impact. And that holds us back a lot, actually, because it means that operationally we have maybe a conceptual and sometimes case study based, evidence based to tell us which direction to move and what would be a useful practice. But we haven't been able to nail it in those hard ways of saying this leads to that. So I think there's work to be done.
There is another question, but how do we get somebody here?
Shalanda.
A very good presentation, and Andy, you put up all the elements. But you, as you indicated that you emphasized about the systemic change, and which you link to the experience of the person who is leading that, implementing that systems, innovation systems. And you said what is good today may not be holds tomorrow. So it's a dynamic, it's a different situation, different things. So when we are talking about the larger impacts, because ultimately this innovation system process has to go to the national or local level, and those actors have to adopt these kind of approaches, then the larger impact will be, we can't do that. So again, I come back to the systemic and the personal individual experiences. So how really build the capacity, and what work and what approach we should focus to, so that we can transfer some of these the methods. And it's really difficult. Location is specific and situation is specific. So once we are not there in another situation, is not happening again. So,
well, I remain a firm believer in the power of case studies to explore how systemic change, how the innovation process takes place. But I think the emphasis needs to be on cases where it hasn't just been about localized change, but it's been about truly systems changes. And I'm sure there are examples out there that we could learn from. But how do we equip scientists to be able to work systemically rather than systematically? I don't know. Is it a capacity building thing? Are we bringing in the wrong sorts of people? Is it something about our organizational culture which makes us focus narrowly on problems? I think it's probably a combination of all of those things. But there has to be tools to help us with this. I think those tools are underdeveloped. I think tools around systems diagnosis are too cumbersome and usually poorly implemented. So this combination of tools, capacity and culture has got to be the way to go forward, but it's going to be a long-term agenda.
Thank you.
Take another one from Nairobi. You may be aware of the new structure that's been implemented recently, Andy. So this is a question regarding that, saying, and this is from Emmanuel in Nairobi, saying, what are your thoughts on how these ideas can be integrated into the new ICRISAT structure to improve efficiency, bearing in mind we are a cross-section from genomics, breeding, adoption, and impacts?
Well, you've got two global programs. One on, let's call it, genetic gain expertise, which then needs to map onto the country programs, and a global program on innovation systems, for want of a better word. But a global program which has in it tools and frameworks to help people think through how to engage with systems change, which is going to be necessary for impact and the use of our technologies. So I think if those programs can truly play a role in providing that science base and those tools and that expertise to help the country programs implement, I think it could work. And saying that there's a difference between the genomics and impact, I don't think these are separate things. I think these are integrated parts of a bigger agenda of how do we progress innovation and impact. And sure, there's going to be some issues about making the bits fit together, but as a strategy, having those two core sets of science and expertise seems to be very logical.
Srini. Microphone.
Thank you for the very exciting presentation. I have probably two concerns, two questions maybe. One is that, these questions, although it started 20 years ago, they are still very basic. Like we are more interested in making change than understanding how we are making change and making change in a very informed way. So in this very fast course of ambitious journey of making change, we are getting trying to embed science research into development programming also. There's no there is science in monitoring and then evaluating, but nothing for learning. There's no analysis, as you rightly mentioned. So how do we make change in an informed way? And who's going to fund this? Because nobody seems to be interested in this. Because everybody is interested in change, but not really knowing how change happens. I forgot my second point.
Yeah, that'll do. No, two really good points. Okay, if you want to make change in an informed way, I like that language, and I think that's part of my arguments about the importance of innovation systems as an analytical framework. Here's a framework. It needs some work on it, but here's a framework, nevertheless, that helps you learn about how innovation is happening and what's effective and what isn't. Who does that? Well, ICRISAT's developing a global program with the word innovation systems in it. I would have thought that some of that work could be in there, but I think some of that work needs to be in the kind of organizational level M&E. So you can imagine that you could have research studies on innovation, but you actually need to have a more routine type of analysis so that projects and scientists and programs can continuously learn about what's working and what isn't. And that's more in the realm of MEL rather than in research. The more challenging question is, who's going to pay for all of this? And I don't think we're ever going to be able to get large pieces of external funding for standalone projects that help us learn better about how to do innovation. That might be a rather bleak outlook, but it says to me that if we really believe that, what's your words, making how to do change in an informed way for impact, if we really believe that that's core to the delivery of our organizational mandate, it would seem to me that that's what internal resources would need to be used for, whether they come from the CRPs or wherever. Just like, if a project's not going to pay for a computer and you need a computer to do your work, you're going to have to buy it yourself.
Okay, we have to wrap up there, Andy. Okay. So it was a fantastic opportunity for ICRISAT to learn from your long experience, and I think because you had such a connection with ICRISAT originally, you're quickly able to understand the types of successes that we're having. And one of the great things about having a new program is there's a lot of work that's already going on that we can already study. So yeah, join with me and thank Andy for giving this seminar. And